That's better. Let me start over. We're going to spend a few moments this morning talking about King Coniah. As we mentioned just a moment ago, we don't know a lot about him. His reign only lasted for about 3 months. But there are some things about him that are very important to us. And what we're going to do is we're going to kind of go through about 3 or 4 different steps in this lesson this morning. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to go through a brief history of the Jewish people from the time of Abraham. And then we're going to come up to the time of Coniah, and we're going to look at 3 different scriptures that deal with Coniah, and then we're going to draw a conclusion, I think, that's very pertinent to us today from those scriptures that we read about Coniah. Now, I'll tell you on the front end here, Coniah, he's kind of his area that he, at a time that he lived, and the kings that surrounded him can be very confusing because his grandfather was King Josiah, and maybe most of us have heard of King Josiah. He was a very good king. But Josiah had 3 sons, and each of those 3 sons at one time or another reigned as king, and every one of them is known by more than one name. And even in the scriptures, they're known by more than one name. And then we come down to Coniah, who was his grandson, who reigned as king, and he's known by 3 different names. And all of this is kind of piled in there together, and it takes a little sorting out, and hopefully we'll be able to go through that and get a clearer understanding of it. But one of the most important things we read about Coniah is that he was the end of a dynasty. He was the end of a physical dynasty. And we'll get to that later on in the lesson. But we're going to spend a few minutes talking about him. He was the second to the last king. He was the second to the last king to reign on David's throne there in Jerusalem. Now, before we get into that study and the details about Coniah that we mentioned, we're going to take a quick look at the history of Israel to help understand the time in which he lived. And one of the reasons we're going to go through this quick history, and a lot of this is going to be things that some of us already know, but we need to keep in mind that we don't all come from the same place in life. We don't all come from the same place. We don't all know the same things. We don't all have the same background. So I think it's good for us to go through some things like this every once in a while just to help us keep the time frame and keep the timeline straight in our own mind. But we're going to go back to the time of Abraham. Go back to Abraham, someone who surely all of us are somewhat familiar with, and see some of the things beginning there and work our way down very quickly to the time of Coniah. About 4,000 years ago, God promised to make a great nation from Abraham. That was almost 4,000 years ago when that happened. That's an awful long time. But God promised Abraham that he was going to make a great nation of, that his seed, his descendants were going to be like the sand of the seashore. That there was going to just be a whole bunch of them, and God certainly fulfilled that promise. And he also promised to Abraham that through one of his descendants, one of them, that all nations of the world were going to be blessed. And of course, that one descendant was talking about Christ. He was going to be a descendant of Abraham. Now, the fulfillment of these promises began with the birth of Isaac, his son. And we remember that Isaac was born late in Abraham's life. I think Abraham was about 100 years old when he was born. Sarah, very old as well past childbearing years. And Isaac was the first child she ever had. So we see God beginning to fulfill these promises and bringing these promises about through the birth of Isaac. And as the story goes on, Abraham begot Isaac, and Isaac begot Jacob, and then Jacob begot the 12 patriarchs, Jacob's 12 sons. Now, these 12 sons of Jacob, they were the beginning of the 12 tribes of Israel. When we look at the names of the 12 tribes of Israel, they reflect most of those 12 sons that Jacob had. So that was the beginning of the 12 tribes. Now, Jacob was also called Israel. That's another guy in the scriptures that's got more than one name, and a lot of them do. He was also known as Israel. So from this point on, the Israelites, or the children of Israel, as we often call them, are synonymous to what we think of as the Jews today. Now, we remember the story of Joseph. He was one of Jacob's 12 sons. Remember, he was Jacob's favorite son. Remember that he had some visions and some dreams from God and told his brothers about those, and boy, they didn't like it. They didn't like it, and they didn't like the fact that he was Jacob's favorite. They didn't like that multicolored coat that he had made for him. And they took him and they sold him off as a slave and took that coat and dipped it in blood and carried it back to Jacob and said, is this your son's coat? Knowing full well, if any of them had seen that coat anywhere, they would have known it was Joseph's. But Joseph goes on into Egyptian captivity. He's down there as a slave in Potiphar's house, winds up being thrown in prison, interprets some dreams in prison, and then finally he comes out and he interprets the dream for Pharaoh. That Pharaoh had about the 7 cows that were thin and 7 cows that were fat, and I think it was some ears of corn that were very thin and some ears of corn that were very fat that were predicting 7 years of good and 7 years of famine. And because Joseph was able to interpret that dream, Pharaoh raised him up to a position of authority second only to him. So after all these problems, Joseph rises to power, second in command, and eventually brings all of his family down into Egypt. And that's a wonderful story. If you're sitting home one night and you don't have anything to do, get your Bible out and read that story of Joseph. And that is a very touching, very, very heartwarming story, especially as you get towards the end of it. Well, after the death of Joseph, we know that there was another king or another Pharaoh came into power that didn't know Joseph. He wasn't familiar with him and what all he had done for Egypt. Joseph had actually been instrumental in making Egypt as wealthy and as powerful as it was. Now this king, this Pharaoh, he looked out there and saw all of these Israelites, and boy, there was a bunch of them. And he became afraid. He was afraid that they would join in with some other nation, and if they would gang up with some other nation, that they would overthrow Egypt. So what he did is he takes the Israelites and forces them into slavery. He makes slaves out of all of them. After that, we remember the story of Moses. God raised up a deliverer. God raised up Moses, who was born to those slaves there in Egypt, to his parents who were slaves, after the command had been given to kill all the male children. But they just couldn't do it with Moses. Remember, he put him in that little ark of bulrushes, and they set him afloat there in the river near where Pharaoh's daughter would go and bathe, and she found him and took him and raised him as his own. Moses was raised in the household of Pharaoh just like a grandson of Pharaoh, but he decided that he wanted to go and serve God, that he had rather suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy those passing pleasures of sin there in the household of Pharaoh. So God sends him back, and he brings his people out after all those 10 plagues that we read about, and they come out of Egypt, and God gives the children of Israel there, after they come out of Egypt, the law of Moses there at Mount Sinai. And we remember some of that story, that the 10 commandments, which were also a part of that law of Moses that was given to the Israelites, and that's important who that law was given to. It wasn't given to us. It was given to the Israelites. And God spoke those 10 commandments to the people. May not always think about that, but when they were there at the foot of that mountain, God didn't just speak to Moses, but he spoke to the people, giving them those 10 commandments, and it like to have scared them to death. And they wanted from that point on for Moses to talk to God and not them. So they got that law there, and then they continued on up there to Kadesh Barnea, which is right on the border of the Promised Land. They send in those 12 spies, and 10 of them bring back the bad report, except for Joshua and Caleb. They come back and they believe the bad report that they weren't going to be able to take the land, and they rebel against God, and they rebel against Moses there, wanting to go back into the land of Egypt. And because of it, God makes them wander in the wilderness for 40 years until all of those that were 20 years old and up died in the wilderness.
20.
What did I say?
10.
10? I'll have to check the tape on that one. 20 years old and up. That is correct. But They wandered there, and when the 40 years was up, Joshua led them into the land. Joshua led them into the land that God had promised to give to Abraham's descendants. They finally got that promised land. And after conquering in the land, the children of Israel were ruled by judges for about 350 years. Now, I throw that number out there, and I'll put some disclaimers on it. There are a lot of different estimates about that time, and there's a lot of confusion about that time. As a matter of fact, if we get into it next week in the book of Acts, Paul is going to call it 450 years. But I think Paul is including the time that they came up out of Egypt up until the time that Samuel died, which is about the time that Saul died. So this included a large period of time that Paul was talking about, but the actual judges themselves that we think about, those 13 judges, around 350 years. We think about Deborah and Gideon, Samson, and Samuel, probably some of the more famous of those judges, some names that we might be familiar with. And during the days of Samuel, and we might think of Samuel, I've always kind of thought of him maybe as the greatest of the judges, the Israelites once again rebelled against God. They rebelled against God and God's desire for them to be ruled by these judges. Instead, they wanted to be ruled by a king. They wanted to be like the nations around them, like these heathen nations around them. And I think there's a lesson in that for us as members of the church. We don't want to be like those heathen nations around us. We don't want to look at what all that denomination is doing and what all this denomination is doing, and why can't we be more like them? We don't want to fall into that trap. We want to simply be the people of God, living by the Word of God as He's presented it to us simply in His Scriptures. But they wanted to be like the others. They wanted to be like the heathen. And because of that demand for a king, it led to one of the saddest verses in the Scriptures, in my opinion. One of the saddest scriptures in the Bible. In 1 Samuel chapter 8 and verse 7, God's talking to Samuel and says, "And the Lord said to Samuel, Heed the voice of the people in all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them." What a terrible decision that was on the part of these Israelites. We go on and see that God selects Saul, the son of Kish, to be their first king, and that was around 1050 BC. Time's passing on pretty quickly here. About 1050 BC, Saul becomes king, and God's not pleased with him. We know God's not pleased with him because of disobedience, and because of it, God takes the kingdom away from the family of Saul. Saul's son never becomes king. Well, Saul's son never was able to last as a king. One of them was made king for a short period of time over part of the kingdom, but he did not last because that was not God's plan. 1 Samuel chapter 13 and verse 14, it says, "But now your kingdom," this is what Samuel is telling Saul, "but now your kingdom shall not continue. The Lord has sought for himself a man after his own heart, and the Lord has commanded him to be commander over his people, because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you." Going to take it away, and he's going to give it to somebody else. And the somebody he's going to give it to is a man after God's own heart, and that's David. We know that man to be David, and David probably one of the greatest kings that Israel ever had. Now, this is the same David that we know about that slew Goliath as just a young man, as a youth, probably in his early teens. And he went out there with that sling and took on that Philistine giant and buried that rock up in his forehead and then cut his head off. That's the same David. Now, David's reign lasted for about 40 years, and then his son Solomon becomes king. Now, the most interesting thing we have about Solomon was that he was granted great wisdom by God. Everybody knows that Solomon was a very wise man. And the fame of his wisdom spread all over the earth. He had a great start as king. He started off very humble. God told him, "You tell me what you want, and I'll give it to you." And you know what he asked for? He asked for wisdom so that he would be able to judge God's people. And God gave him that wisdom and gave him wealth and power to go along with it. But when he became old, as smart as he was, as wise as he was, when he became old, he turned away from God. 1 Kings chapter 11 and verse 4. So it was so, when Solomon was old, that his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not loyal to the Lord his God as was the heart of his father David. And David got involved in some bad sins, but his attitude towards obeying God was that's what he wanted to do. And when he was confronted with those sins, he repented of them. And Solomon just wasn't like David. He just wasn't like him. He didn't serve God like David did. Now, because of the wickedness of Solomon, God split the kingdom of Israel into two different kingdoms. Now, this is a major change coming down now in the kingdom of Israel. It's now because Solomon was so wicked that God, I think if God hadn't made the promises to David that he had made, he'd have took all of it away. But because God loved David so much, and because he had made promises to David, he left a small part of that kingdom in the hands of David's descendants. But he splits it into two different kingdoms. Judah was known as the southern kingdom, and it was made up of the tribe of Judah and what was left at that time of the tribe of Benjamin. So we have mainly those two making up that southern kingdom. The 10 northern tribes were known as Israel, or the northern kingdom. Many times through the scriptures, when it's talking about Israel, it's talking about those 10 northern tribes. Now, as we mentioned a while ago, David's descendants continue to reign over Judah, over that southern kingdom. The northern kingdom, though, had several different dynasties. They had several different families that reigned over them from one time or another. And almost all of these dynasties were brought to some kind of violent end. Of the 19 different kings that reigned up there in the northern kingdom, not a single one of them was good. Not a single one of them was pleasing to God. And because of their wickedness, the northern kingdom was carried away into Assyrian captivity around 722 BC. Because they were just so wicked. And God sent messenger and prophet and messenger and prophet up there time and time and time again. Some of the greatest prophets we think about in the Old Testament, that's where they went. Men like Elijah. You won't find a greater man, a greater prophet than Elijah, and he worked in the northern kingdom. Elisha worked in the northern kingdom and many others, but they just weren't successful in turning those people away from their sin. So they were taking it away. God had them sent away into Assyrian captivity, not to be returned. Now the southern kingdom, which Judah, was a little different. A little different. One of the differences was that all their kings came from the same dynasty, from the same family. They were all descendants of David. They were all descendants of David. Some of their kings were good men. Some of them were very good men. You think about men like Asa and Josiah and Hezekiah, all very good kings that reigned in that southern kingdom. There's probably 5 or 6 good ones that actually reigned, but still the majority of them, sadly, the majority of them were wicked. Most of these kings that they had just simply were not willing to do what God wanted them to do. They wanted to continue to do the things that those nations around them were doing. And because of their wickedness, God sends them into Babylonian captivity for 70 years. God didn't send them away into captivity permanently because he needed to preserve a remnant. He needed some to come back and have that lineage through which Christ could come. So he sent them away for 70 years and brought back a remnant of those people into Israel. And that happened about 606 BC. That's when they went into Babylonian captivity, 605, 606 BC. And it's shortly after the start of this Babylonian captivity that we read about King Coniah. Now, Nebuchadnezzar, when he first took the nation, when he first took Jerusalem, he allowed them to continue to have some kings for a short period of time. But he eventually had to put an end to that. But this is about the time frame that we're talking about. The kingdom has split. The northern kingdom has gone away. It's no longer there. Basically, what you've got left is the tribe of Judah the tribe of Benjamin and some of the stragglers who had come down from the northern kingdom over the years, who were trying to get away from some of that wickedness up there. That's who's left. And now they've been taken away into Babylonian captivity. Now, after the death of good King Josiah, he was the last good king that they had. 3 of his sons reigned as king, and we mentioned that earlier. 3 of them became king. The first of Josiah's sons was named Jehoahaz. And Jehoahaz has a different name, but we'll just stick with Jehoahaz for now. He reigned for only 3 months, though. After 3 months, the king of Egypt, now this was before the Babylonians came in and took over, the king of Egypt came up and took him away captive and made his brother Eliakim king. So now we have 2 of the sons of Josiah being king, and now Eliakim is king. And Eliakim, when he became king, the king of Egypt changed his name to Jehoiakim. So now we have another name change, which helps with the confusion here. But he reigned for 11 years. Jehoiakim reigned for 11 years, and he was a very wicked man. Put in place by the Egyptians. He seemed to have no interest in serving God. He just was a wicked, wicked king. It was during the reign of Jehoiakim that Nebuchadnezzar first captured Jerusalem and took away that first bunch of captives there around 606 BC, during the reign of Josiah's son. About 606 BC. Now, that's the first time. Now, we need to keep in mind something that kind of adds to the confusion for some people is that Nebuchadnezzar came back several times and took away captives each time he came. And then finally came in the last time around 586, 587 BC and destroyed the temple and broke down the walls of the city. Some of the first captives taken here around 606 would have been the men we know well, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. We know those names. We know a little about their lives, and we won't go into much detail about them. But after the death of Jehoiakim, his son Coniah becomes king at 18 years of age. Coniah becomes king when he's 18 years old after his father dies. Now, Coniah is known by 3 different names in the scriptures. And this also kind of lends to the confusion. But he's known as Coniah. He's also known as Jeconiah and Jehoiachin. And he's called by all 3 of these names in the Bible. So it's one of those things where we may can understand it to a point. May have been given some of these names by some of the foreign kings, like his uncle had been. Some of them just may have been different versions of his name. We're often called by more than one name. We're maybe called by our first name. Somebody might call me Lee. Every once in a while, somebody might call me Mr. Moore. I don't hear that very often, but it happens. And I may go to the doctor's office or something like that, and next thing I know, somebody's calling me Albert. And I don't get called Albert very often, but that's my first name. And when I put it down in the paperwork, well, that's what they call me. So we can understand how somebody could have different names. But this one is known by all 3 of these in the scriptures. Now, most of what we know about old Coniah is recorded over in 2 Kings chapter 24. Starting in 2 Kings 24 and verse 8, Jehoiachin, that's one of those other names for him, this is Coniah, was 18 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem for 3 months. His mother's name was Nehushta, the daughter of Elnathan of Jerusalem, and he did evil in the sight of the Lord according to all that his father had done. King at 18 years old for 3 months, and just as wicked as his father was. No indications of going to turn out any better. At that time, the servants of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came up against Jerusalem, and the city was besieged. Now, this was another time. And 606 was the first time. This was about 8 years later. So Nebuchadnezzar has come back again. The city was besieged, and Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came against the city as his servants were besieging it. Nebuchadnezzar sends his army over. They start besieging the city, and later on Nebuchadnezzar comes himself. Then Jehoiachin, or Coniah, king of Judah, his mother, his servants, his princes, and his officers went out to the king of Babylon, and the king of Babylon in the 8th year of his reign took him prisoner. Now, I don't know if they went out there under the pretense of, let's try to make some peace, let's talk about this, or just exactly what the circumstances were. But when they went out, Nebuchadnezzar took them prisoner. He took them prisoner and he carried them back to Babylon. And he carried out from there all the treasures of the house of the Lord and the treasures of the king's house. And he cut in pieces all the articles of gold which Solomon, king of Israel, had made in the temple of the Lord, as the Lord had said. Excuse me. You want some kind of idea what happened to the Ark of the Covenant? I think Nebuchadnezzar chopped it in pieces. I think he did. Just like he did many of these other articles that were in the house of the Lord. Now, he didn't do it with every single one of them, because we know later on that they were using some of those cups and things of that nature. But things that he didn't see any use in, he just destroyed them, chopped them up, melted them down, and used them for the gold. Also, he carried into captivity all Jerusalem, all the captives and all the mighty men of valor, 10,000 captives and all the craftsmen and smiths. None remained except the poorest people of the land. This seems to be a pretty major deportation of people out of Jerusalem here. All the people of wealth, all the people of power, all of these people are now taken out of the city. All the men who might be men who would be warriors, all these mighty men, they're all taken away captive to Babylon. And he carried Jehoiachin, Coniah, captive to Babylon. The king's mother, the king's wives, his officers, and the mighty of the land he carried into captivity from Jerusalem to Babylon. All the valiant men, 7,000, and craftsmen and smiths, 1,000. All who were strong and fit for war, these the king of Babylon brought captive to Babylon. Then the king of Babylon made Mattaniah, Jehoiachin's uncle, king in his place, and changed his name to Zedekiah. Now, we mentioned a while ago that 3 of Josiah's sons reigned as king. We'd already talked about 2 of them. One of his uncles that had been carried into Egypt, then Coniah's father, and now his uncle has now been made king. And we see another name change here. His uncle was known as Mattaniah, but his name was changed to Zedekiah, and Zedekiah is the name we normally know him by. Now, the biggest things that we learned from this are, just recap them real quick, that Coniah only reigned for 3 months. He was king for only 3 months. He did what was evil in the eyes of God. He was carried away to Babylon, never to return. He never came back from Babylonian captivity. And Nebuchadnezzar made Coniah's uncle Zedekiah in his place. And Zedekiah made the 3rd son of Josiah to reign as king. Now, we'll just kind of put that up on a little chart here, see if this helps. You got King Josiah, the last good king that they had. He had 3 sons, Jehoahaz, and then he had Jehoiakim and Zedekiah. And then Jehoiakim had his son Coniah. Now, the way this took place was after Josiah died, Jehoahaz became king for 3 months. King of Egypt came and got him and made his brother Jehoiakim king instead. Jehoiakim reigned for 11 years, and then his son Coniah became king. After 3 months, Coniah is taken prisoner by the Babylonians, and the Babylonians make Zedekiah king. And Zedekiah reigns for 11 years, and he's actually the last king to reign in Jerusalem. He is the last one to reign, and he is the last descendant of David to reign in Jerusalem. Now, there's a little more information that we need about Coniah. A couple more places we're going to go and look at some scriptures, and then we're going to make a very important point. In Jeremiah 22, starting in verse 24. As I live, says the Lord, though Coniah, he's called Coniah here by Jeremiah, the son of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, were the signet on my right hand, yet I would pluck you off. If you were the seal on my right hand, something of great value, I'd pull you off and throw you away. And I will give you, here's what God says is going to happen to you. I'm going to give you into the hand of those who seek your life, and into the hand of those whose face you fear, the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and the hand of the Chaldeans. Now, this is a prophecy by Jeremiah about what's going to happen to Coniah. Now, we read already where it happened, and this is Jeremiah talking about it earlier on. So I will cast you out and your mother who bore you into another country where you were not born, and there you shall die. Remember who went into captivity with him? His own mother went into captivity with him. But to the land to which they desire to return, they shall not return. They're going to want to go back home, but it's not going to happen. Is this man Coniah a despised, broken idol, a vessel in which is no pleasure? Why are they cast out, he and his descendants, and cast into a land which they do not know? And the answer to that is because of sin, because of wickedness. And listen to verse 29. O earth, 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 hear the word of the Lord. Thus says the Lord, write this man, talking about Coniah, write this man down as childless, a man who shall not prosper in his days. For none of his descendants shall prosper, sitting on the throne of David and ruling any more in Judah. Now he's saying write him down childless, and that doesn't mean there that he's not going to have any children, because the next sentence there he talks about his descendants. But he's not going to have a child to sit on the throne. He's not going to have a child to sit on the throne of David. And as a matter of fact, God says none of his descendants shall prosper, sitting on the throne of David there in Judah. God says specifically that none of the descendants of Coniah would be able to prosper on the throne of David in Judah anymore. It's come to an end. It's come to an end. None of them would be able to prosper there anymore. Now, one more piece of information about Coniah, then we'll make our main point. Matthew chapter 1 and verse 1. Matthew 1 and 1 says, the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Now, what's going to happen through the first chapter here in Matthew is they're going to trace the genealogy of Jesus all the way back to Abraham, starting at Abraham and coming down to Jesus. And we're not going to go through and read all of that, but we're going to skip down to an important point here, starting in verse 10. As this genealogy of Jesus is being given. It says in verse 10, Hezekiah begot Manasseh. And there's a couple of names we might remember. Hezekiah was probably the best king that Judah ever had. Manasseh probably the worst, his son. And Manasseh begot Ammon, and Ammon begot Josiah, which we've been talking about. And Josiah begot Jeconiah, Coniah, Jehoiachin, that same man we've been talking about, and his brothers about the time they were carried away to Babylon. Now this Jeconiah is the same person as Coniah, that's also known as Jehoiachin. Jesus was a descendant of Coniah. He was a descendant of Coniah. Now why is that important? Well, do we remember what God said about Coniah's descendants? Do you remember what he said about them? That none of his descendants will be able to sit on David's throne in Judah and prosper anymore? None of Coniah's descendants were going to be able to sit on David's throne in Judah and prosper. Just wasn't going to happen. Now, since Jesus was a descendant of Coniah, would he be able to sit on David's throne in Judah and have a successful reign? Couldn't, could he? Couldn't. The answer to that question is no. Jesus was not going to be able to sit on David's literal physical throne in Judah and have a successful reign because he was a descendant of Coniah. If he had, that would have been a violation of that prophecy that was made. He simply wouldn't be able to sit on David's literal throne in physical Judah and be able to have a successful reign. Now that one fact that we took all this time to get to completely destroys the doctrine, the main premise of premillennialism. Premillennialism, the main point of it, the main fact of it is that Jesus is going to come back to this earth, that he is going to set up his throne and his kingdom in Judah, in Jerusalem, and he is going to sit on David's literal throne in Jerusalem and have a physical reign for 1,000 years. But God says he can't do it. because he is a descendant of Coniah. This idea that Jesus is going to physically return and reign in Jerusalem for 1,000 years is just not what the Bible teaches. Now, you stop and think about how many millions and millions of people believe that Jesus is coming back, that he's going to have that physical reign. This whole idea of premillennialism and all the little peripheral false doctrines that are taught around it, like the rapture and different things, it's all blown out of the water by that one fact that Jesus cannot sit there. He cannot have a physical reign on earth. If he did, it would be a violation of prophecy. And Jesus never violated any prophecy. He fulfilled prophecy. The prophecy about Coniah makes it impossible for Jesus to have that physical reign in Jerusalem. The truth is, Jesus is sitting now, not sometime in the future, but now on David's spiritual throne, not his literal physical throne. And he's ruling over his spiritual kingdom, not a literal physical kingdom like they're looking forward to, but his spiritual kingdom in heaven. He's not on earth. He's not going to reign on earth, not in a physical sense. Remember what Jesus told Pilate? And this ought to be enough for most people to understand it. When he asked him if he is a king, and he said, "Yes, I'm a king." In John chapter 18 and verse 36, and Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world." It's not a part of this earthly world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight. In other words, Pilate, if I was going to be an earthly king, you'd have your hands full right now. You'd have a rebellion on your hands. My men and my followers would be pulling swords and they'd be fighting. But do you see that going on? Well, no, because his kingdom is not of this world. But my servants would fight so that I should not be delivered to the Jews. But now my kingdom is not from here. It's not from here. It is a spiritual kingdom. And when Jesus said it's not from here, it didn't mean that it's not from this place I'm standing. He meant it wasn't from anywhere in this world. He said that from Jerusalem, by the way. It's not from here. What's our conclusion? What a shame it is that millions of people have fallen for that false teaching that Jesus is coming back to reign in Jerusalem. Because along with that false doctrine seems to be that idea of maybe a second chance in there somewhere. The rapture is going to take those good away, and then the rest of us left will have a chance maybe to get right with God before it's over with. It's not there. It's pointing to men wants to die. And after that, the judgment. You know, we see millions deceived, and sometimes we shake our heads and wonder why, but we need to be careful ourselves. We need to be careful ourselves not to be deceived by false doctrine, because we've got the same type minds and mental makeup that many other people do and most other people do. And if others can be deceived, we can be too. But the only way for us to prevent being deceived is for us to know the truth. We need to know the truth. And the only way to know the truth is to study it. We need to spend time in studying God's Word, so we'll be able to recognize these false doctrines, like this false doctrine of premillennialism, when it's presented to us. Well, that's the conclusion of the lesson. I appreciate everybody's attention. We'll have a short intermission before the next service.